Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Jennifer Sallin, and I've had the privilege and honor of working for the Arab American Institute for many years. AAI is a registered 501c3 organization, and our Yellow Vote program does nonpartisan voter education and registration. AAI also does opinion polls tracking the concerns of Arab American voters. Those polls have been consistent since 1996, but this poll is different. It provides a snapshot of Arab American community concerns at this critical moment. With that, I'm turning it over to AAI President, Dr. James Zogby, who will share the analysis.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining. I've been doing this, as Jen noted, my brother and I, going back to 1996. We actually did our first poll of Arab American attitudes in 1990, working with Lewis Harris for USA Today, trying to get a read on how people approached Iraq and its invasion and occupation of Kuwait. We were getting a message from the community that everybody is this way or everybody is that way, and we knew that not to be the case. So we wanted to get some hard data. The data was fascinating, got published, and we got the idea from then to continue working on this with our community every other year, polling to get party preference, candidate, and the major issues of concern to the community. Having said that, I would say that this poll was rather shocking. We've had a couple of other, I would call them sort of turning point moments that took a longer period of time to occur. The community always had been leaning slightly Democrat, not unlike other American ethnic communities who came over beginning of the last century. They leaned Democratic, but they gradually began to drift Republican. But even in the 90s, the community was always like 3 or 4 points more Democrat than they were Republican. That gap opened up during the Bush years. And I used to joke that the community registered and voted more like Hispanics after by the time you got into the Obama years than the Italians or the Irish or the Polish, which we had been like earlier. This poll had a dramatic turnaround. And let me go to the first slide. You can see it. The dissatisfaction with President Biden is really quite significant. Ellie, do you want to go to the first one? His numbers are dangerously low, more so than I've ever seen for a Democratic candidate for president. The next one shows the decline in support from where he was in 2020, which was at 59% down to 17%. The Republican numbers don't shift very much. The numbers that are independent or other candidate not sure, those are largely Democratic voters who are not ready to flip onto to support Joe Biden. They're upset, and we'll see why in a minute. That's a rather substantial number of people not there right now. The question is, will they go into the Democratic camp? One doesn't know, but if they're not sure now and angry enough now, it may take something bigger to move them into the other camp, back home, rather, I would say. I don't expect them to be voting for Donald Trump, but I do think that it'll take something to get them to go to the polls in the first place. Let's go to the next slide. This is the one that I think was actually really quite shocking. We've never seen this kind of flip in such a short period of time, where people aren't even ready to identify as Democrats anymore. It's different. I was talking to somebody in London the other day about if you're a member of the Labour Party, you actually get a card. You get a card if you're in the Tories. You go to meetings. That does not happen here. Being a part of a party, you do in many states register. You get to vote in the primaries, but being a member of a Democratic or Republican Party means largely you're on a mailing list, you're on a phone call list, you get robocalls and emails for money. But there's no organic integration into a party organized activity that starts you on the precinct level and works you up to the national level as it used to be. So it's really a question of party preference or party. I mean, how do you sort of see yourself? The fact that the Democratic numbers dropped to 23% from where they had been in April, and actually the 2 years before at 40-something% is really quite a precipitous drop, and indicates how the degree to which dissatisfaction with the president and his policy has taken a toll, not only on support for him, but on identification with the Democratic Party. As somebody who's been on the DNC for 30 years and cares about this, it's this is not something that that I take lightly. Let's go to the next slide, and you'll see what I'm talking about in terms of the precipitous drop from 40, where it had been in 2020 and 2023 earlier this year. This precipitous drop in just several months of 17 points is really quite significant. Look at where we were in the Obama years, when after George Bush and the frustration over the Iraq War and people getting upset about all the surveillance issues and the profiling and all of the other things that were being done. And George Bush was saying, don't target Muslims and Arabs. John Ashcroft was doing exactly that. I mean, the policies were not the same as the rhetoric coming from the administration, and it took a toll. We went from almost 2 in 5 people identifying as Democrat to up to 54% by the time Barack Obama ran for office, and the numbers were 2 to 1. Back in 2008 and 2016, they were 2 to 1 being Democrat over being Republican. It dropped, and it's continued to drop, and it's really quite significant. I think the decline here. Again, I don't know how you get that back easily. We've had some discussions about that, but I think that's something worth noting. Let's go to the next one. This is the reason why the drop. Disapproval, right? The numbers back in April were about consistent with the national. His numbers weren't good, but they weren't god awful. Right now, they're god awful. It's 2/3 viewing him negatively, and only 20% saying they give him a positive job performance. Those are not really good numbers to work with. And the reason why, let's go to the next one. Oh no, this is just the precipitous drop in his positive attitude. Just, do you like him or don't you like him? Was 74% in 2020. Dropped to 47, almost a tie. Again, that was Arab Americans sort of being where the rest of the country was, having favorable, not favorable, balanced attitudes. And now look at where it is right now, and after just a very short period of time. Let's go to the next one. This is the reason why for the drop. Why the drop? It's either very negative or somewhat negative. 2/3 saying his handling of this issue was not good. Next one. Oh yeah, we were skipping over 2. I thought this was important. Large majorities were concerned about anti-Semitism and anti-Arab bigotry, with obviously a greater number concerned with anti-Arab bigotry than anti-Semitism. But they're sensitive to the fact that the violence and the backlash that could result from it will affect and could affect both communities. This is important as a check for us on the general status of the community. The one we did back in April, we were seeing a disturbing situation developing in some school districts where some groups in the Muslim community were actually partnering with or working with Moms for Liberty, one of the truly anti-Muslim bigot organizations in the country, to get LGBTQ books out of schools. They were doing it in Dearborn, a few other places in Michigan, and they were doing it here in Montgomery County. And so we wanted to get a read on where the community was on this and a few other issues. And the poll numbers that really stuck with me in that one were the 80% were opposed to state laws that penalize people who support the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, but an almost equal number opposed school boards banning LGBTQ books. This was a community, in other words, that knew what it meant to be a victim of cancel culture, knew what it meant to be a target, didn't want it to happen to them over Israel-Palestine, didn't want it to happen because of your sexual identification. And so we were pleased about that. And I'm pleased about this. I mean, if I got numbers that said they weren't concerned about an increase in anti-Semitism, I would have been concerned, but they are. They're concerned about anti-Semitism. They're obviously more concerned about what will happen to the community. Let's go to the next slide. Majority report having experienced discrimination. And the largest numbers were 74% of Arab Americans in the 18 to 34 range, and 70% of Arab Americans who are Muslim experiencing this kind of discrimination because of their ethnicity, country of origin. We know kids who, parents tell them, don't go to school, don't wear a keffiyeh, don't show anything about your ethnicity or your support for Palestinians, et cetera, because of their concern about, the backlash that their kids may encounter. There has obviously been the ADL, which is on, Mr. Greenblatt's on every show, every day, 2-3 times a day. He's on some of the networks. And I understand there is a concern about anti-Semitism in the schools. Very little conversation about the backlash against Arab and Palestinians in particular. There are some at the White House who've tried to turn this into an Islamophobia thing. It's not. This is about, right now, there has been an anti-Muslim backlash that is decidedly Muslim after 9/11 with Donald Trump, with some of the work that's been done by neoconservatives and some on the far right who've been absolute bigots in dealing with Islam and Muslims in America. This one is about Palestine, and it's about Palestinians, and the victims on college campuses are paying a price, and it's happening without public attention. There's almost a McCarthyite atmosphere on campuses about kids being afraid to talk about Palestine. And there's some places, universities, that are, ADL is now trying to ban and punish students for justice in Palestine and have them accused of material support for terrorism. That is horrific. I took note at an article I saw. I see Jacob is on from the Forward. There was an article in the Forward that I saw another Associated Press piece on about Dartmouth doing it right. Instead of banning activities and on campus, they brought the faculty together from the Middle East Studies program and the Jewish Studies program and conducted rather massive town halls for the student body. They engaged students in discussion rather than push them to the position where they ended up having to be in isolation and or have frustration boil over on both sides. Bringing the students together to talk was just a brilliant move on Dartmouth's and I think it's something that should be followed around the country. There is a problem. People are experiencing it deeply, exacerbating it with rhetoric coming from either the White House or from the ADL doesn't make it any better. Accusing Students for Justice in Palestine or Jewish groups like Jewish Voice for Peace of being anti-Semitic, that's not making this go away. It's actually causing it to fester. And it's really important to have conversation with students, in particular on university campuses. And that's not happening right now, except, as I say, in a couple of instances like Dartmouth. Let's go to the next. This is a no-brainer. Are they concerned about Palestine? Absolutely, they are. Is there another one? Facing discrimination? Yes, they are concerned about it. And I think that's the last of them, isn't it? One more? I think we're done. Okay, here's the points I want to make, is that what really intrigued me looking at this poll, not just the quickness of the shift that we experienced, that just in a matter of a couple of weeks, people's attitudes moved so quickly. What also intrigued me was the extent to which the shift occurred among every group, whether they were Democrat or Republican, whether they were Muslim, Christian, Catholic, Lebanese, Egyptian, Palestinian. Some of the crosstabs are difficult. I know some asked for the crosstabs. When you're polling a 500 group of people and you have such a diverse community, you can see a Christian number, you can see a Muslim number, but a lot of the in-between groups, the numbers are too small to come up with a measurable, if the number is like 50, the margin of error in that subgroup is so large that we don't really like to look at them that way. We like to look at the overall numbers. But I did take note of the fact that across the board, there was a decline in support for the president. Across the board, there was a decline in support for the party. And across the board, there was support for Palestinians and concern about the potential for a backlash. What does it mean? It means that in states like Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, where Arab Americans were worked hard by the Biden campaign and were grateful to have the opportunity to participate in the campaign because they had experienced some real difficulties with Donald Trump. It would be difficult in this state of mind to mobilize support. Something is going to need to be done to win them back, and it could be a more difficult call, I think, than just doing a nice White House meeting or something. There, I think that they were traumatized by this, as traumatized as they were with the Donald Trump behavior, as traumatized as they were with the Iraq War, as traumatized as I've seen them be back in '82 over the Lebanon War, or in 2006 over the war in Lebanon at that point. This happened so quickly, and the attitudes shifted so fast that it indicated to me something very dramatic was going on here. And I think it was worth noting, and I was glad we had the opportunity to do it and share it with you. Thank you all very much.
Jim, with that, are you ready to take some questions? I know Andrea Shaw Issa has one to start with. Andrea, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Hi, Andrea. No, you went mute again.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks for doing this. I appreciate it. The survey is really remarkable. I think I have a couple of very specific questions. Why is it that you think, despite Trump's behavior and the Muslim ban, that 40% of Arab Americans still support Trump? That number is up 5%. That doesn't account for the whole move there. And then I'm also really curious about your comment just now that it's going to take something extraordinary to sort of win them back. I mean, what if you were, if the White House called you up and said, "Hey, Jim, how do we fix this?" What is there a chance of fixing it, or is it really, are these voters gone?
Let me start with the first one. The 40% Trump. Remember, there's a margin of error factor here. This could actually mean no difference between what he got when he ran last time. And I think that the overall Republican numbers are not moving. The 30-something% is about where they've been, with a margin of error of a couple points here or there. So I'm not, more significant is the precipitous drop in people wanting to support Biden. In all the polling we do, There are Republican voters. There are Democratic voters. And they're going to vote for George Bush, whether he's done what he's done, and Donald Trump, no matter what he's done. They see this as their interest, and some of them are second, third generation, and some of them are diehard conservative, like the folks in Michigan who were supporting banning the books in the schools and mobilizing with Moms for Liberty. And we had a lot of Arab Americans working in the Bush administration, in the Trump administration, et cetera. They've been reborn since they wanted to get media gigs, and some of them have, but it is what it is. Into every family, every life a little rain must fall. I joke about that, but I mean, we've got Republicans and we got Democrats. The Democratic number is the one that's the interesting one, Andrea. It's the precipitous drop, and it is so precipitous. And it does track initially some of the general mood. My brother and I were talking about this, and he'll be on my Coffee and Column next Wednesday talking about it. There's something going on. The economic indicators are good. Things are moving in the right direction in the country. Consumer buying is up, and yet 70% of the American people think they're worse off than they were. So Arab Americans are not immune from that sense of not feeling that this White House is getting the job done. So the fact that they were dropping before this, like the general public was dropping before this, makes sense to me. The 74% down to 47%, that made sense. The dropping now further, as precipitously as that the most recent drop was, that's a question of a policy, which did it in a very short period of time because the policy and the things that were being said by the president and others in his administration were horrific and were hurtful to people in the community. And there was no check or sense of balance in how you do this. And I said to the White House back in the beginning, I said, even Reagan in '82 left himself an escape hatch, which allowed him in September at one point to finally say, stop, and look sternly at Begin and warn that there'd be repercussions. And guess what? It stopped. Is Joe Biden going to do that? Can he do that? I don't know. But will it take something like that? I think it will. It'll take something like that to stop what Israel's doing. It'll take something like that to convince people that he gets the fact that something horrific has happened here. And the rest of that I'll let go. But when you get a drop that precipitous, to get it back up means that something has to happen to undo what happened. And part of the Israel thing, we can't do anything about that. I mean, that's not going. This administration is not going to change Netanyahu from a frog to a prince. But what they can do is change something about the way they behave, and statements about equal measures of blah, 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 which we've been hearing now for 3 years, have become ashes in the mouth. It's like, you're saying a nice thing, but you're doing nothing. And allowing this to continue as long as it's gone on with no check or just private messages saying, please protect civilians. Please don't do this. We're worried about civilians. That's not cutting it for people in the community is what's clear.
Okay, Jim, I want to go to Sabrina Siddiqui has a question next from the Wall Street Journal.
Hey, Jim, thanks so much for doing this. And apologies if I missed this toward the top, but do you have the reflection of how the numbers have changed in the run up to the 2020 election and now, but do you have a rough percentage of how many Arab Americans actually turned out and voted for Biden in 2020? And then secondly, obviously, Michigan is one of the states that's drawn a lot more attention because of the size of the Arab American population there. What are some of the other key battlegrounds where you think that this drop could make a difference in the 2024 election? Thank you.
Well, thank you. In terms of turnout, the numbers have been high in Michigan, and there's 3 or 4 counties. I know of Macomb in particular, and Wayne, and another, where the actual number in the census is in the 6% range. And what we have found in the past is that when Arab American turnout is greater than the national, as it has been in some elections, it was in the Obama ones, and it was in 2020, then that percentage goes up in terms of the percentage overall. Statewide in Michigan, it's about, it comes to about 4%, which is really good. And if you increase that, it can make a huge difference in terms of the overall state. The other one that I think was of consequence, which is actually where the campaigns really focused attention, was Pennsylvania. And in the Northeast Pennsylvania area, the coal country, in Pittsburgh area and in the Erie area, a lot of attention was paid to Arab American voters, as well as other ethnic voters, but Arab American voters as well. And they turned out in fairly large numbers, and even helped elect a couple of Congress people who they cared about. The turnout had not been as great in 2016, but in 2020, the turnout was greater. And like I said, the campaigns focused attention on getting Arab Americans to turn out in both of those states. There are others where the numbers are, there's a goodly number in the northern belt of Ohio. There's a very significant number in Cook County and DuPage County. In Northern Virginia, the numbers are big, but those states, Ohio hasn't been a battleground state now for a number of years. Illinois it isn't usually, and Virginia is sometimes and sometimes not, but I haven't seen the impact of the community there as great as it was in Pennsylvania or in Michigan.
Okay, and our next question, I'm going to ask Ethan Holmes to unmute himself. Oops, apologies, Ethan, I might have messed you up.
No worries. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, where are you from, Ethan?
I am Ethan Holmes with Sputnik News. Thank you for this briefing and for taking my question. You mentioned that the precipitous drop in support for Democrats among Arab Americans does not necessarily translate to a rise in support for Republicans, but there does seem to be a marked increase in independent identifying Arab Americans. So in that independent umbrella, is there any indication that Arab Americans are drifting towards the Libertarian Party, the Green Party, alternative candidates such as RFK, or any other distinct actor within the independent umbrella, or is there support kind of in the ether, so to speak? Thank you.
I think it's a resting place. Remember, it's not, there's no independent party. There may be one in some states, an American Independence Party. I think there is one, but I think in the category as it comes to mean something for voters is that I'm not in this one, I'm not in that one, I'm not voting in their primaries, and so here's where I am. It's like it's a parking lot. It's like I don't want to be in either one. As far as voting for a third party, Arab Americans don't have a history of that. The only time that they did in the polling that we did, they weren't Ross Perot supporters, for example. What they did was they did vote in large numbers for Ralph Nader. And while there were some who wanted to pretend that, some of my Republican friends, that George Bush won the overwhelming Arab American support, that was because one Muslim group did an email to their fax back then. There was no email, there was faxes back then. They sent a fax out to people saying, who'd you vote for in this election? And then came back with 80% voted for George Bush. That wasn't true. In the Arab community, the numbers were about 43% for Bush and about 38% for Gore, but 13.5% for it was 45% Bush, right? 38.5 for Gore, and 13.5 was for Ralph Nader. And Ralph Nader was an Arab American. Ralph Nader spent time talking to the community. He also spoke about Palestine in a way that other candidates weren't. And I am embarrassed to say this, but it's the fact that having Joe Lieberman on the ticket had an impact on some Arab American voters who said they just couldn't vote for the guy who had been the lead on the Jerusalem bill, et cetera, et cetera. So that was the only time I recall a significant third party output. I don't expect Bobby Kennedy or Cornel West to do significantly well. There will be, as you see here, 13 and something% for Bobby Kennedy. I think when people get down to making choices, they'll either go for Biden or for Trump or whoever the nominees are. We don't know at this point, but or they'll stay home, which is a likely prospect. As much as I'd like to see them turn out, I think it's going to be a hold your nose election for many of them at this point, unfortunately. So next question is that.
Next, we're going to Russell Contreras.
Hi, Russell.
Hey, thanks, Mr. Dogby. Appreciate the poll.
And where are you from?
Albuquerque, New Mexico for Axios.
Okay. Hi.
Can you talk a little about the challenge of getting data from Arab Americans? Because I see this poll, it only has 500 respondents, and unfortunately, Axios can't use it. We have to have at least 1,000. But I've come through and I'm trying to get attitudes, perspectives from Arab Americans to balance out the coverage. But I'm having a really tough challenge getting data that can compete with other polls that are out there. Can you talk a little bit about why this is a challenge of getting this data from Arab Americans from across the country who have a diversity?
500 is pretty large.
I know, but we
saw a poll today with
we just can't use that.
Coverage,
we just can't use it at Axios. It's 1,000 or nothing. It's got to be.
I see a lot of national polls on how Republicans are going to vote with 400 plus. 404, I think, was the one today, describing the DeSantis Haley competition in the national polls. So no, I think we've polled 1,000 on one occasion. It's a cost issue, but 500 is. We usually do 400, to be honest with you, but 500 is pretty substantial. It gave us enough of a set of crosstabs where we wanted to be able to do religion and country of origin, be able to have a sense of getting the right proportion and split. We do some weighting, Alec. We have to do the weighting because, Russell, because we, in a poll where you're dealing with a community as diverse, and with as many component parts as it has, you need to be able to make sure you've reflected all segments of it. In every area, what was interesting about this was that in many of the areas, the numbers did track earlier polls. It did track on religion. It did track on country. We didn't have to do much weighting in those areas where I think, what I also thought was interesting was that even if we moved numbers around a bit to weight, it didn't make a difference because the individual component groups had very similar attitudes. Those who were Maronite Catholic or the Lebanese Catholic had very similar attitudes to those who were Orthodox or those who were Muslim. So there wasn't a difference. People were upset about what happened. I think the takeaway, in other words, is that people are upset. People have lost their confidence in this presidency, and are distressed enough to not only say they're not going to vote right now, but also distressed enough to say they're not even identifying with the party, his party. We've not seen that before, except like I said, in the Bush years when the number dropped, but the numbers dropped from 40% down to 27%, and this is 40% down to 23%. This is a bigger drop and happened over a much shorter period of time. The Bush drop took 8 years to do. This is happening in just several months. Could it be undone in several months? It could, but I'm not quite sure what could be dramatic enough to undo what was so dramatic as to cause it to happen in the first place.
Okay, we have, I believe, a follow-up from Andrea. Is that true, Andrea?
Yes, please. Thank you so much. Jim, I'm just wondering if you can illustrate or talk to us about why Arab American support for Biden had gone down to, it must be like 35%, right? Then from 59.
Mhm.
And then the additional drop that we've seen now, the 18% drop. So was that just reflecting a general mood?
I think it was, there was a sense of he wasn't Trump. That was why the 74% was there. And he, for all the reasons that the public saw Joe Biden as, and what's the word, an antidote to the sort of the toxic atmosphere of politics. He was a cure for that. But I think we saw with the general public mood a continuing slide in support and attitudes. It just didn't seem that things were moving in the right direction as they'd want them to. I just had a conversation with my brother about this, and there's almost something not rational about this, in the sense that, like I said, all the indicators are good, and yet the public mood is sour, and Donald Trump is still able to convince people that we're going to hell in a handbasket when we're not. But why is it that the Biden support numbers are his favorable ratings or his job performance ratings are as low as they are, when actually he's done a good job in most ways, and at least they ought to be stable instead of dropping. So when the Arab American numbers dropped, it was like the general public mood was dropping. Maybe a little more dramatic for Arab Americans because they had been so high, because they had been so affected by the toxicity of the previous administration. But the numbers dropped in the last couple of weeks, even more so. And we gave it time to settle in. I mean, we didn't poll right in the beginning. We waited 3 weeks. I think is indicative of the fact that this issue, I'm tired of hearing. We're polling in the Arab world right now too, in 12 different countries. We started before the conflict began. We stopped when it began, took a break, and then continued again. So we'd have half and half results before and after. The numbers, I've seen some of them already coming in. The numbers are way down. I'm tired of hearing pundits or analysts, who think that they know something. Folks who've failed previous administrations and have, that on their watch, the prospects of peace died and America's credibility in the Middle East collapsed. Are the analysts on television say, well, I think that, we're past the Palestinian people, don't care about it anymore. They're looking for, well, the answer is no. Palestine remains the wound in the heart that doesn't heal. It is as emotionally important to people of Arab descent as Wounded Knee was to Native Americans. And that cannot be forgotten. This is a symbol of a hurt. And it's real, and people react viscerally to it. I don't understand why we have a situation. I had a conversation with somebody at the White House about this, and it was weird to me that they just didn't get it. I said, look, don't take me wrong. I'm not equating the two at all, but I'm telling you that when I saw what happened on the 7th, I understood that the trauma of the Holocaust was, and the pogroms were playing out. It was grabbing people in a way that reminded them of their vulnerability. And I said, for Palestinians, it's the same. This is the vulnerability that comes from having a narrative that was developed around the Nakba, around the dispossession. I'll never forget Bill Clinton speaking to an audience of, when he went to Gaza to speak to the Palestine National Council, and he used the words, I understand your history of dispossession. of being dispersed. And it resonated with them because they said to themselves, he gets us, you know. Well, person at the White House I was talking to shot back at me. He said, I can't listen to this, but all, you know, this whataboutism. There's no parallels here. And I said, I'm not saying this, but that. I'm saying this and that. And you have to understand, both peoples have narratives, both people hurt, and both people see events unfolding that are sort of reinforcing that history of hurt that's very real. And if you don't get that, then what you're saying is that Palestinians don't count in this equation. Well, what Arab Americans are saying here, whether they be first, third, fourth generation, Christian, Muslim, immigrant, you know, whatever, they're saying Palestinians matter to us. What Israel's doing matters to us. And you, Mr. President, are not paying attention to what is happening to a people who matter to us. And I think that's basically what it comes down to. And it's not all of them. I mean, there's like 20% who say the issue is not important. I understand that. I mean, there are people, you know, people who don't care about gun violence. You know, people don't care about, you know, there's some people don't care about abortion. Some people don't care about, you know, whatever. People are not a monolith, but they do have some deeply held feelings. And this is a deeply held feeling that is resonating with at least 2/3 plus of this very diverse community. That was a very long answer to a short question, but thank you. Anybody else?
Jim, I'm not seeing any other questions at this time. So if you want to have any, like if there is a final comment or thought you want to share before we wrap.
Yeah. Write the story for Axios, buddy. 400, 500 is a big number. I guess, look, I understand if you have a company policy, but when you're doing small groups, it sometimes is enough if the demographics are right and the balance is right. And I felt pretty comfortable that we got the balance right and we got the demographics right. And so comfortable with the numbers. And like I said, we've been doing this now for 27 years. But thank you very much. I do think that we'll take a look at this again sometime late in the year, or maybe early next year as we get into the 2024 cycle to see how things are playing out. But this did give us an ear on the ground and a sense of where people actually were. I wanted to get a feeling for that. We got it, and I know that we now have a better sense of where this community is. I've seen so many articles that in the anecdote stuff, you know, it's people just playing off of, you know, the guy who said the entire community is feeling this way, meaning the 5 guys he had coffee with last night. It's like we're not playing that. We're actually working with hard data to come up with the contours of, like I said, a very complex community. So thank you all very much.
Thank you all very much for your time today. We appreciate it. If anyone has any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to me. The email is jsalan@aaiusa.org. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a good day.
Thanks.